The humming sound the ship made seemed muted. I mean, let me start over. I apologize. The humming sound the ship made seemed muted after the cacophony of the battle. How long had it been? He couldn't remember. William stifled the urge to move or touch the controls, knowing his salvation lay only in inaction. If he fired the thrusters too soon, he might miss. It was hard. Every instinct he had screamed for him to run as far and as fast as possible. Every bone in his body hurt. Every muscle felt as if some mad and vicious thing had chewed on him and spit him out instead of swallowing. Bone deep pain, the kind that lingered and followed you into the darkness of sleep, was his only companion, shouting its presence in the silence blackness that grew larger and more encompassing as he drifted away. The pod could have held more than one person, three tops if they were small. There wasn't any other cargo. It held another it held enough rations for two humans for a month, enough air and water for longer if you stayed calm and immobile. He'd once heard of someone who survived in a pod like this for almost an Earth year. They'd been in suspended animation and their oxygen requirements had been minimal in that state. Hopefully, he wouldn't need to be here long. Hopefully, someone safe found the vessel before he ran out of options. It was comforting to know that he had options unlike those he'd left behind. Though they were few, the reality of having more to look forward to than just death soothed him. A balm for his shattered nerves. He'd been tested beyond the realm of his previous imaginings by the last few days. Yet he'd learned how strong he was, how deep the determination to survive ran through his veins. If he closed his eyes now, he would probably see the faces of those he'd left behind in the ship. Their faces and what he'd done, how he'd changed them, left his mark until nothing remained, nothing human, that is. William looked out the window at the rapidly retreating point of light that had been his home for more than 2 years. The light came from the incineration of the ship's interior fixtures sealed away from the vacuum of space by layers of metal and silicone composites that made up the hull, but to the unaware, it would be normal lighting of the freighter. A metal tomb that burned merrily in place because there hadn't been a breach from the outside. No destruction had come from within. His trajectory, providing he caught the solar wind stream he aimed for, would take him a long loop towards Mars and potentially safety. If he didn't catch it, he still might get drawn into the slight gravity well of one of Mars' many moons, which still offered him the chance for salvation. But it would take longer. Options, paths to take, all of them leading away from was into what might be built on the ashes of his former life, a life that ended in pain. The pain was nothing compared to the fear. It was fear that held him immobile more than anything else. Fear that he hadn't left anything behind. Fear that something had clung to him or the pod. That something remained. Something that even now lay in wait for him to let down his guard so it could get in and do to him what it had done to his crew. For the moment, all he could feel was fear, the same suffocating madness that had been his constant companion for the last 4 years. When he'd begun to see the creatures lurking behind their eyes, begun to fear the faint hissing in their throats when they spoke, watching them change, watching the metamorphosis had stolen most of his logic, stifled his ability to think, to reason, trapped. He'd been trapped in the ship with them as they shifted from human to something other, and back again before his eyes. That was the worst part of this, beyond the pain, beyond the terror. The knowing they had changed, that something had stolen who they were, now looked out of their eyes, speaking with the same voices but not, knowing everything they knew but warping it, using it to further some agenda he couldn't fathom because he wasn't one of them anymore. He wasn't like them. They were new, and he had been left behind, chosen to remain unchanged, unincluded in the newness of what they were. There hadn't been any choice really but to do what he'd done, none at all. The panel before him beeped and struggled to beeped and he struggled to lift his head to look at the readout. The pod wasn't automatic. He had to function. He had to actively work the controls in order to do anything at all, although it could be controlled remotely from the ship. He leaned forward slightly, his head spinning and vision graying out from the pain. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his reflection in the window. Something about it felt wrong. The thought the thought sent adrenaline shooting through his veins. William turned his head, working to keep the breathing even, not to waste oxygen, ignoring the now steady beep of the panel. Closing his eyes, he stilled himself to look at his face. Someone else looked back at him. The scream built somewhere in his gut and erupted from his mouth before he registered the need to make it a sound. It took longer to realize the sound come from him. For a moment, the horror of what he saw overwhelmed his senses, and he struggled against the restraints on his chair, not remembering having, having fastened them, but knowing he'd had to have it done. After all, no one had helped him into the pod. No one had been alive to help him. He'd killed them, stabbed out their eyes to get at the thing hiding behind them. Hiding in plain sight, he remembered using his slim metal knife, his arm moving again and again. The hot wash of blood and the stink of death mixing with the sanitizing agents the shipbuilders fused into the recyclers. They were dead. He'd killed them all because they'd changed and he had it, and no one would be safe until he removed the threat, that possibility of a threat, by removing them. One second. William stared. The steady beeping of the panel adding a throbbing counterpoint to the wild thudding of his heart, and he struggled to regain his control and figure out what was wrong. What was different about the reflection he saw in the dull shine of the window? Terror swamped him, filling his nose with the scent of his sweat, and the sour copper stench of blood, until he felt the slim, steady steam of tears falling and pooling on his chin. He tried to raise his hand to wipe them away and realized he couldn't. Tearing his gaze away, he looked down and saw his arms were bound to the rest, restrained individually, one to each side. The crash restraints for jumps, locking his limbs in place to cushion and protect them from the G-force of high-speed maneuvers. Had he made a jump? No, he'd killed them. He set the oxygen tanks to explode, and he'd gotten into the escape pod alone, because they were all dead. He closed his eyes, the tears falling faster, remembering Renate's face. The look of surprise as he thrust his knife into her eye and dug out what was hiding there. The look of fear and horror frozen in a single instant of pain, then nothing because her eyes were gone. The beeping began to slow, and he looked back at the console, his eyes drawn to the screen before him again, the unusual display replaced by a steadily decreasing series of numbers. A countdown to what? He tried to remember. Renate, Z, Morgan, Alf, Logan, Daniel. Screaming faces, missing eyes. All of the things blocking them so they couldn't see him, didn't hear him, or know him. He'd had to do it. He had to. The tears came faster, fell harder, and his chest hitched, his nose clogging shut. He moaned and cried into the stillness. His friends, his crew, like family. He shook his head to clear it, saw something else. Someone floating, tethered to the far end of the small cabin. Not in the other seat, but near the floor, Renate. As he'd seen her last, the empty sockets of her eyes blackened and shriveled, the edges crusted with dried blood. He wanted to scream, but found he lacked the breath for sound. Lacked the breath because something was wrong with the air. He could feel it now. The heat, the scent of rotten eggs, the beeping distracted him again. William struggled to make sense of anything, but there was too many parameters, too many questions, and no answers, just a hollow sound, his shuddering tears, and the beeping of the panel as it counted down. His vision blurred again. He tried to shake his head to clear it, realizing his movements were slower, his eyes closed. He forced them open again, trying to remember what he'd forgotten. He needed to see, to make sure nothing remained, so he could be sure he was safe. Was he safe? Did he get them all? He couldn't remember. He looked over at the floating form again. It was Renate, her dead empty eyes staring back at him accusingly. You did this, William. You. Cut the eyes from her head. Stop the beat of her heart. What did you see? Is it staring back at you in the window? He shuddered and tried to take a deeper breath, but couldn't. The air was wrong, but somehow that didn't scare him as much as it should have. He tried to smile. I had to save you, Renate, because I love you, he whispered and closed his eyes. The pod finally floated far enough away they knew they would be safe. Daniel nodded to Z. She ran her fingers slightly over the screen, firing a single missile. She stared after it in silence, like the other occupants of the room, the gravity of the moment too heavy for mere words. The bright flash of the explosion momentarily blinded them, and she blinked several times to clear her vision before standing and walking towards the door. We didn't have a choice, Z. You know there's no hope once they have it. Daniel's voice halted her, and she looked back and nodded. He would have killed us all or given it to us. You did the right thing, made the right choice, Z said, then left. The others trickled out behind her. Daniel stared out the window, looking at the small cloud of debris spreading out in a circle from where the pod once floated. He was captain now. Not the way he thought to get the promotion, but William had caught it. There was no cure. The only way to protect them all from so far from home. Only one way to keep them all sane. The brutality of the solution left a sour taste in his mouth. William had been a good man once, a good friend. That was all just a memory now. Memory is what is left when nothing else stays. A stain on the soul, only time washes away. Pain and memory intertwined, drifting away until only a ghost of it remains. Daniel activated the screens for the windows and turned to walk back to the upper deck, shaking off a bit of his melancholy and the need to do his duty. It would be another week before they were all in the clear for sure. No one else had contracted the virus. For now, he would do what he needed to do. He owed it to the rest of them to make do today. Answers would have to wait. He caught his reflection in the shining surface of the metal doors leading to the bridge. Was there something on his face?